My name is Walter Rowland, and this happened to me in 2003, a year I assumed would be like any other. I work as a small-town police officer in the sleepy town of Southwest Valley, Oregon, and I enjoy a life that isn't very exciting. I spend my days resolving small conflicts, walking the same routes, and getting coffee at the diner where everyone knows my name. My wife, Liz, and my two children, Tim and Holly, are the center of my universe, and I lead a simple life which is perfectly acceptable to me. Took a while for anyone to notice when things started to go awry because Southwest Valley isn't the type of place where you expect a lot of excitement. It's a small, unassuming town where people take care of their own affairs and leave their doors unlocked at night. It started with a missing person report, but nothing too unusual happened. Sometimes people wander off. Mrs. Davis, who lived alone on the outskirts of town, called to report that her son Jim, a construction worker, hadn't been home for 2 days. Kyle was known to go on benders occasionally, but he would always arrive sheepish and hungover. "Would you please check on Jim for me, Walter?" Mrs. Davies's voice crackled over the phone. "Sure, Mrs. Davies. I'll swing by his usual haunts and see if I can track him down." I grabbed my keys and left, driving past the usual locations: the bar, his workplace, and even the dilapidated motel where he occasionally crashed. But there was no sign of Jim. His co-workers hadn't seen him either, which was strange because they said he had been acting strange lately, paranoid, even claiming someone was following him. I assumed this was just the alcohol, but I made a note to keep looking. Days stretched into a week, and Jim was still nowhere to be found. Mrs. Davis was becoming anxious, and to be honest, so was I. Southwest Valley isn't a place where people simply disappear. One evening, Mike, my friend, and Smith, the town's other police officer, called me. He said in a low, serious voice, "Meet me at the old Hanson place." The place was an abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of town. On Halloween, I drove there with headlights piercing the darkness and met Mike outside. "What's going on?" I asked, getting out of the car. It was a remnant of a bygone era that had fallen into disrepair. It was the kind of place where kids dared each other to go. I asked, "What's going on?" And he said, "You need to see for yourself." He led me inside, where I was immediately hit by a musty smell with a faint hint of something else, like metallic. When Mike aimed his flashlight at the floor, I noticed a large, sinister stain seeping into the wood. Blood. Lots of it. Jesus, Mike. We searched the entire area, but there was nothing else. No body, no clues, just that huge pool of blood. I called in backup from the county, and soon the place was teeming with forensics. I muttered, "Who the hell, no idea?" To which he replied, "But it's fresh, can't be more than a day old." As the days went by, more people began to vanish. Ellie, the diner waitress, the elderly man, and Thomas, who lived alone, were the first to go missing. Each case was eerily similar, with no witnesses or signs of struggle. The town was on edge, and Liz was afraid. I tried to reassure her, but to be honest, I was also afraid. One night while I was on patrol, Liz called and said, "There's someone outside." Her voice trembling. "A shadow appears to be moving close to the barn. Stay inside and secure the doors. I'll be there in 5 minutes." My heart was pounding as I hurried home, and when I got there, Liz and the children were huddled in the living room, looking pale and trembling. I took out my flashlight and went to the barn, gun drawn, because the moon was high and creating long, eerie shadows. I heard a rustling sound and a faint whisper as I got closer to the barn. I opened the door and shone the light into the darkness, asking, "Who's there?" I called out steadily, my voice piercing my gut. But for a moment there was nothing, and then a figure entered the light. It was a shabby, filthy man with untamed eyes that seemed to pierce me. His clothes were ripped and covered in blood, and he was thin, almost skeletal. I hardly recognized Jim. He asked me to help him, and he whispered, "He's coming," I asked. "Who's coming?" Before he could respond, collapsing to the ground. I called for an ambulance, and Jim was taken to the hospital, where he was in poor condition but alive. When he finally woke up, he told me a story that made my spine tingle. According to Jim, a man who identified himself as the Hunter, he claimed that this man would kidnap people and keep them in an underground bunker in the woods, where he would provide them with food to last until he determined it was time to retrieve them. Jim had barely escaped, but I told the county sheriff about it, and a search was set up. We searched the woods for days without finding anything, and the disappearances kept happening, making the town more terrified. One evening, I was at home attempting to unwind with Liz and the kids, and it felt like a nightmare knowing that someone was waiting and watching. The sudden darkness was unsettling, so I reached for my flashlight. The phone rang, and my heart was racing. Roland said, "It's Mike. You need to get to the station." I grabbed my keys, told Liz to stay put, and drove as quickly as I could to the station. When I got there, Mike had a look on his face that I had never seen before. Fear. He said, "We got the Hunter," and I asked, almost not believing it. "Up at the old quarry, a place that has been abandoned and overgrown. You won't believe this, Walter." As Jim had explained, we discovered a makeshift bunker in a secret clearing where we located the missing the town's residents, some of whom were still alive, were horrified by the scene, and I had to use all of my strength to remain composed. The Hunter himself was present as well. He was a middle-aged man with a cool, collected manner who simply grinned icily without resisting arrest. Smile as we took him away. The town struggled to comprehend what had happened, and the aftermath was a flurry of activity. Rescue efforts, media hysteria, and incessant questions. Families grieved and things started to return to normal. But Jim and the other survivors had a long road ahead of them and required time to recover both mentally and physically. James Award, the collector's true name, was found guilty and given a life sentence without the possibility of release. We found comfort in the knowledge that he would never harm anyone again, even though the horror he inflicted on our town would never be forgotten. As for me, I returned to my usual routine, but I was different. There was now a sense of unease in the still nights of Southwest Valley. I found solace in my family and the small pleasures of life, but I couldn't get rid of the thought that we had come across something genuinely malevolent. Liz would frequently ask me how I was doing, and I would reply that I was fine, but I knew deep down that the events of that year had affected all of us. Southwest Valley was still our home, but things had changed, and as life always does, the town gradually recovered and new families moved in, and I continued to do my job and protect the people I cared about. Even though I knew that evil had arrived in our town, but we fought back and survived even in the safest places. Danger can lurk just beneath the surface, waiting to strike, and it was up to people like me to stand watch to keep the darkness at bay and to protect those we love. I told myself that was enough, but occasionally, when the night was especially quiet and the shadows seemed a little too long, I would find myself thinking about James Award and the darkness he brought into our lives. This happened to me in 2005 when I was just a regular guy living in Denver. I was a mechanic by trade, owned a small garage, nothing fancy, had been married and divorced, and spent most of my days fixing cars and evenings at my favorite dive bar, Jay's Place. I liked that life was straightforward and predictable. One night, I was enjoying a beer with my friend Jake Hinting at Jay's Place. Despite being a real teddy bear, Jake is a large, bald man with a thick beard who appears capable of bench pressing a truck. We weren't talking about anything specific when this guy at the bar started ranting about some weird cult out in the desert. I said, "You're telling me that there's some cult out in the desert doing who knows what, and no one's done anything about it? They're dangerous." He replied, People go missing out, their cops don't bother looking anymore. I laughed it off, but Jake, being Jake, became curious about what they do, Jim sacrifices, and then nodded his eyes wide. Furthermore, they are interested in some really bizarre things. Jake has a fascination with mysteries. He enjoys solving them, or at least attempting to, and I prefer a low-key existence, but persuaded me to take a look. He said, "Just for kicks. Come on, Thad." The following weekend, we packed up some supplies, a couple of flashlights, and my old .38 special just in case. Jake's excitement was contagious, and we drove out into the desert, Jim's directions scrawled on a napkin, following a barely there dirt road for what seemed like an eternity. We arrived at an old, deserted-looking gas station as the sun sank below the horizon. I asked, "Is this it?" Jake replied, checking the napkin. Jim advised us to start here and head south for about a mile. The desert air was still chilly, but Jake was already marching ahead. We walked for about 20 minutes before we noticed a flicker of light in the distance. We approached CAU, which was a campsite, but not your typical one. There were perhaps a dozen people gathered around a large bonfire, chanting something, and I couldn't make out Jake, and I exchanged glances. "This is nuts," I whispered. "Take a closer look," Jake answered. And as we advanced, staying in the shadows, I was able to make out them better. They were dressed in long, dark robes and had odd masks on. The chanting became louder and more intense, and I felt a chill go down my spine. Suddenly, the chanting stopped, and one of them moved forward with a large knife in their hands. Jake gasped, "Oh my God," because it appeared to be the leader. I grabbed Jake's arm and whispered, "This is no joke. We need to get out of here," while the others cheered. However, a scream broke out before we could move. My blood ran cold when I saw that Jake, always the braver one, had stepped forward, pulled his flashlight out of his pack, and the group froze. He shouted, "Shine the light on them! Stop!" And for a moment, everything was silent. Then, chaos broke out, and I ran back towards the car, hearing footsteps behind us get closer, and Jake fumbled with the keys. Just as he opened the door, he was grabbed by one of them. I turned, pulled out my .38, and fired. The figure fell, and Jake scurried into the car. We fled, sending hearts racing and dust flying. We went straight to the police, and they took our statement, but I could tell they weren't very interested. "We'll look into it," the officer said, but I knew they wouldn't. Jim was right. Nobody wanted to deal with the desert cult. For a few days, everything was quiet. Jake and I tried to return to our regular routine, but it was difficult because we couldn't stop thinking about what we'd seen. Then one night didn't show up at Jay's. I called his phone, but there was no answer, so I went to his place. He wasn't there either and reported him missing. The police dismissed it, saying that he probably just needed some time alone. But I knew better and was determined to find him. I returned to the desert, this time by myself, following the same route, my heart racing with each step, and when I arrived at the campsite, it was empty, but there were indications of a struggle. As I looked around, I heard a faint, desperate noise and saw broken branches trample the ground. I followed the cry for assistance and discovered Jake bound in a tiny, obscure clearing. He was bruised and bloody, but alive. We stumbled back to the car, supporting one another, and I saw 3 figures standing at the edge of the clearing watching us. I raised my gun, but they didn't move, so we drove back to town. This time, the police took us seriously, and with Jake as a witness, they organized a raid on the campsite. They found it empty, but they also found evidence, robes, masks, knives, and other items, that the cult was real and dangerous. Jake recovered gradually, but the event left its mark on him. We remained close after that, our friendship cemented in the crucible of that night. Jake and I still joke about it occasionally to try to lighten the memory, but deep down we know how close we came to something truly evil, so that's my story. The police never caught the cult, and they seemed to disappear into the desert like ghosts. Eventually, life returned to normal, but I'll never forget what happened. I hope you never experience it, but if you ever find yourself in the middle of the desert and you spot a glimmer of light in the distance, turn around and head in the opposite direction. Some things are better left alone. You can call me Willie Bullwood. In 1985, when big hair and rock music were popular, I was just a guy trying to figure out what I was doing. I had my share of ups and downs, but who doesn't? I'd always been skeptical, never really buying into the whole something out there idea that changed one night, and I'm still piecing together what happened. I lived a simple life in the small town of Westbrook, Iowa. I used to love the solitude. On the outskirts of town, surrounded by fields that stretched as far as the eye could see, my modest two-bedroom affair cozy home was cozy but not fancy. One evening, it was late, maybe around midnight, and I was home alone as usual after a particularly long day. I drank a few beers while listening to the crickets and feeling the weight of the world melt away. Not enough to knock me out, but enough to ease the pain. My faithful old dog. It was one of those nights when everything seemed to be going as usual until I heard a muffled thud coming from the back of the house. I assumed it was just the wind or perhaps a raccoon knocking over the trash cans. King was lying by my feet, snoring softly. King's ears perked up, but he remained motionless, which should have been my first hint. Even though King was a sloth, he had a knack for trouble, so I got up, stretched, and headed to the kitchen. The back door was slightly ajar, but I was positive that I had locked it. I scowled as I tried to recall if I had really done it, and I shook my head, assuming that I was simply exhausted and possibly a little inebriated. I closed the door and locked it this time just to be sure. My heart thumped in my chest, and for a moment I thought it might burst out of my throat when I turned around and saw a man standing in my kitchen. He was tall, probably 6 feet, with wild eyes and a scruffy beard. His clothes were filthy, and it appeared as though he hadn't taken a shower in weeks. Without responding, he lunged at me while holding a knife, and I staggered back, slamming into the kitchen table and sending a chair flying. The man swung the knife as King began to bark, a deep, menacing sound I had never heard from him before. I barely avoided the blade, feeling it graze my arm, but adrenaline kept me going. I grabbed the closest object I could find, which was a front pan, and swung it at his head, connecting with a sickening thud, causing him to stagger back, clutching his skull. King bared his teeth and lunged at him, but the man kicked him hard, causing him to yell across the room. I was furious because no one had harmed my dog, and the man had swiftly recovered before attacking me once more. He was stronger than he appeared, and I was beginning to get tired when he knocked the pan out of my hand. I kicked him, aiming for his knee, and he howled in pain, dropping the knife. I scurried for it, grabbing it just as he tackled me to the ground, and we rolled, knocking over chairs and sending dishes crashing to the floor. I swung the pan, hitting him again, but this time he managed to hold on to my wrist. Before I could react, he headbutted me and the knife slipped from my grasp. He was on me in an instant, his hands around my throat squeezing. I gasped for air, clawed at his hands, but his grip was like iron, and my vision began to blur. I thought this might be the end, but then King suddenly lunged at him again, sinking his teeth into the man's leg. "Who are you?" I yelled, my hand shaking. "Why are you here?" He just stared at me with those wild eyes and a twisted grin spreading across his face that I scurried to my feet, grabbing the knife again, this time without hesitation, and driving the blade into his side, feeling the resistance as it went, and he gasped, his eyes wide with shock and pain, and he stumbled back, clutching his side with blood oozing between his fingers. He looked at me, and for a moment I saw something in his eyes, fear. Then he collapsed, hitting the floor with a final thud. I stood there panting, the knife still in my hand, staring at his lifeless body. King hobbled toward me, his tail wagging a little, and I knelt down to embrace him as I felt the tears welling up. "Good boy," I whispered, and I called the police, my hands shaking so much. They looked at the scene, sirens blaring, lights flashing, and began asking questions. I told them everything, including the struggle, the noise in the kitchen, and the man's final words. The following few hours were a haze of inquiries, paramedics, and police officers. King was taken to the veterinarian after they removed the body, bagged up the knife, and dressed me. I was left standing in my kitchen, wondering what the devil had just happened. The man turned out to be a drifter who was wanted in multiple states for a variety of offenses. The police commended me for my bravery, but I didn't feel brave. I felt fortunate to be alive. After that, I fixed up the kitchen, got a new lock for the back door, and spent a lot of time with King, who recovered well. I never did find out why that man chose my house or what he wanted. Perhaps he was just looking for a place to hide, or perhaps he had darker intentions. They found his fingerprints in a few other places, but no one knew his true name. What I do know is that night changed me, but I'll never know. That's my story. I've learned that danger can lurk in the most unexpected places and that you can't always see it coming, but you can be prepared for it when it does. It's not the type of story you tell around a campfire, and it's definitely not something you'd find in a horror book. It's just a messy, unpredictable slice of real life, and if I've learned anything, it's that you just have to keep going forward and roll with the punches because you never know what will happen next. Since life is too short to waste, King and I are going out on a date with the porch and a few cold beers.